Afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to our second panel. You want me to raise it up, or is it okay? Thank you for coming to our second panel of the day. We have two speakers on this panel. Lucia Sa of the University of Manchester and Pablo Gomez of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Lucia Sa is our first speaker. She is a professor of Brazilian studies at the University of Manchester in England. And her research interests include Amazonian narratives, native Amazonian narratives, and Latin American urban cultures. She's the author of the books Rainforest Literatures, Amazonian Text and Latin American Culture, as well as Life in the Megalopolis, Mexico City and Sao Paulo. Her paper today is entitled Metamorphosis and Etiology, Ovid's Metamorphoses and Native Amazonian Narratives.
Thank you. I think I'll follow Heather's example. Can you hear? Yeah. Right. I don't have pretty pictures, or actually ugly pictures. I don't have pictures. I'd like to start by thanking, first of all, Felipe for having invited me, and also Camila and Iris for organizing this fantastic event. I think the first panel was amazing and a difficult one to follow, so we'll try. And thank you also for the organizational team and everybody, and also for getting this amazing weather. Coming from England particularly, it's quite nice to see sun once in a while. Okay, the motivation for this research came from two factors. First, for a long time, I have been fascinated by the etiology transformation in several native Amazonian narrative traditions. Not only Amazonian, in fact. Etiology is a characteristic that links several native traditions from the Americas, and it has intrigued and puzzled scholars of native literatures at least since the 19th century. I have been particularly interested in the role played by etiology in stories that narrate either the marriage between species or processes of shape-shifting or metamorphosis. The second motivation is a bit more mundane, and it was brought by the fact that very frequently when I presented papers on the topic of etiology and transformation, or simply talked about the topic with friends, I was asked whether the processes I was trying to analyze were similar to stories told by the ancient Greeks or Romans, and Ovid's Metamorphoses was often cited as an example. I had read Ovid's Metamorphoses, but I had not consciously attempted to make a comparison. So here we go. It is a research in progress, so bear with. This paper will therefore, you think this is more reliable? This paper, yeah. This paper will therefore compare etiology and metamorphosis is in one collection of Ben-Mon narratives, Theodor Koch-Grünberg's second volume of From Roraima to Orinoco, published in 1917 in German, as the result of Koch-Grünberg's 2-year journey through the north of the Amazon in the borders of Brazil, Venezuela, and Guyana between 1911 and 1913. And of Metamorphoses, published in the 1st century AD and described as one of the most influential literary pieces of all. My main reason for choosing Koch-Grünberg's From Roraima is that, like Ovid's Metamorphoses, it can be described as a collection of stories that deal, for the most part, with etiology and metamorphosis, and also because it's a text that I know and have worked with. I know well and have worked with. Of course, I'm aware that these two works are strange bedfellows. In a later work, Ovid famously disavowed the transformations and etiological explanations that he presented in his poem, saying that they were not supposed to be believed. By contrast, we have reasons to assume that the transformations and etiological explanations included by Akuli and Mayualipo, those are the two storytellers, in the stories they told to Koch-Grünberg were believed, to a certain extent at least, by the storytellers themselves and by the rest of the community. And some of them certainly played important roles in shamanic practice. At the same time, as Andrew Ferrer observed, I quote, much more was at stake for an ancient audience in entering into the world of transformations that the metamorphosis offers than might be immediately apparent to us. End of quote. Quoting Maurizio Bettini's work on Plautus Amphitruo, Latin literature's most extensive treatment of metamorphosis before Ovid's, he reminds us that, I quote again, the possibility of surreptitious transformation figures largely in ancient anxieties about witchcraft. End of quote. Transformation was part of Latin doctrines on dreams, and the theories and practices of divination in other works, such as the Metamorphosis of Apuleius, confirmed the links between metamorphosis and magic at more or less that time. Conversely, even if the tales told by Akuli and Maiolipu are, for the most part, were for the most part to be believed, they were also told with the purpose to entertain and exhibit Akuli and Maiolipu's talents as storytellers, not least to Koch Grünberg and his group of native and non-native travelers. In the case of some of the stories, the idea of a literal interpretation has to be taken with a pinch of salt. Literal interpretation is not the correct term anyway for this kind of narrative. The humorous account of how the Pemon acquired fire by stealing it violently from an old woman whose farts had the power of ignition is met by a competing etiological narrative told by Maiolipu of how fire was created. Similar humorous and obscene is the story that tells how the anus, or puito, floated around freely while all animals, including humans, had to defecate through their mouths. And this narrative, according to Koch Grünberg, had all the audience, including the two Pemon who were telling the story, falling down laughing. Walter Roth also gives an account of competitions among Rio Branco Indians to invent the best explanation for characteristics of animals and plants, that is, etiological narratives. All this makes me suspect that, at least in the case of some of the stories, the idea of belief should not be taken too seriously, or at least that belief is not incompatible with humorous recourses to creativity. In spite of the 2,000 years that separate them, and of the completely different geographical, political, and linguistic context which originated them, Ovid's poem and Koch Grünberg's collection of native stories exhibit, as some of my past audience and friends were right to point out, remarkable similarities. The most obvious is certainly the link between etiology and metamorphosis. As Marina Warner said about Ovid, perhaps with some exaggeration, in Ovid's poem, hundreds and hundreds of metamorphoses are responsible for equal numbers of changes in nature. Yet, this particular etiological characteristic of Ovid's stories was, according to Myers, a novelty at Ovid's time, as most etiological tales prior to his attempted to explain the origins of cultural conquests, not natural phenomena. In one of its most famous and retold stories, Daphne receives the unwanted approach of Apollo, and in her attempt to flee him, she asks the river to change her into something else, being then transformed into a laurel tree. When the boy Phaedon rides his father, the sun's, chariot through the sky, he loses control and comes too near the earth. That is the reason, Ovid explains, why trees were burned and deserts were created in Africa, and that's why Africa's people became black. Phaedon's sisters are turned into trees in their mourning, and when their mother tries to make them alive again, they become amber, the stone that adorns all brides. A cousin of Phaedon's lamented and became a new bird, the swan, who does not trust fire and likes ponds and shallow lakes. In another story, the raven was a white bird whose feathers were made black by Apollo in a rage when the bird spoke too much. When telling the Icarus and Daedalus famous story, Ovid has Daedalus name a stretch of the sea after his dead son, and while doing so, a bird applauded. It was the partridge, according to Ovid, a newcomer to the rank of birds. Elsewhere, a group of men are turned into frogs by refusing to allow the goddess Latona to drink from a pond. When one of her sons died, the shepherds cried and their tears formed a new river. Numerous men, women, and animals are turned into stone. Others melt into water. A new mountain, the Mount Atlas, is formed when the giant Atlas refuses to believe that Perseus is the son of Jove. Perseus himself lets the blood of a serpent drop when flying over Libya, and that is why there are poisonous serpents in Libya. Earlier in the poem, another serpent is killed by Cadmus, who throws its teeth on the ground, and I quote, "From the teeth a new race of warriors sprung to the ground." In Ovid's poem, metamorphosis happens for all kinds of reasons, including filial love, parental pain, offended divine pride, but above all, love and sexual desire. It's not for nothing, as it were, that the Metamorphosis has been called an erotic poem. Time after time, young, beautiful women and a few young men end up transformed into something else as a result of unwanted approaches by a god. Either because, like Daphne, they ask to be transformed into another being so as to avoid the unwanted attention, or because they are punished by the god himself, or quite frequently, by the jealous wife of the god, and so on. Rape is a regular feature of the Metamorphosis, and many of the transformations in the poem are related to rape. Although, as many critics say, there is no formula for the Metamorphosis, as they exhibit a great variation in terms of cause, process, type of characters involved, many, if not most, of the Metamorphoses happen as a result of great passions and suffering. They are, in other words, the result of excess. But some gods confess to being compulsive shapeshifters. The river god Aeschylus, for instance, turned into serpent and into bull to fight Hercules, because of a woman, of course, but lost the fight anyway. Macunaíma, the trickster hero of the Pemon stories, is also a compulsive transformer. He turns himself and his brothers, for example, into crickets in order to enter a fisherman's basket, or into various fishes to steal the fisherman's metal hook. He also turns into a jigger to make one of his lovers laugh. And when she does not laugh, he makes wounds appear all over his body, and then he gets her to laugh. Like the gods in Ovid, Macunaíma transformed men, women, and children into rocks that are still seen in the landscape. Sometimes his motivations are not dissimilar to those of Ovid's gods. In one particular story, he and his brothers are interested in a young woman who scorned them for another man. As a revenge, the brothers turn the man into a sumauma tree, and I quote, "Thus the sumauma tree still looks like that. It never gets broad in the upper part of the trunk." End of the quote. Same way as in Ovid, the Metamorphosis here serves as an etiological explanation for particular characteristics of new natural phenomenon, in this case, a tree. In turn, the iconic tabletop mountains of Roraima, the famous Tepuis, were formed when Macunaíma decided, against the Cutia's advice, to fell a tree. In both these cases, and in several other adventures, the metamorphoses happen as a result of Macunaíma's excess. Indeed, excess is a characteristic of several Native American tricksters, a characteristic that links them to the Greco-Roman gods. But there are also many differences in the metamorphoses and etiological explanations we find in the Pemon stories and those described by Ovid. In Ovid's poem, the great majority of etias and metamorphoses are the result of the actions of lustful, disgruntled, or vindictive gods. In other words, although there are few, rare mortals who can change form out of their own volition, as a general rule in Ovid's poem, metamorphosis is a privilege of the gods. By contrast, in the Pemon stories, even though many transformations, as we saw, are connected to the trickster Macunaíma, he and his brothers are far from having the monopoly of shape-shifting. First, there are many shamans that appear in the stories transforming themselves and other beings, connecting the stories to ritual and healing practices of everyday life for the Pemon. So, Piaimã, the first Pemon shaman, takes up the training of 5 little boys to make them into médicos feiticeiros, or pajés. In the process, 2 of the boys are turned into spirits because they disobey Piaiman's order not to look at him. Similarly, the protagonist of the story, Pauí Podoli, an etiological narrative that explains the origin of the constellation Southern Cross, transforms himself into a tiny little ant in order to hunt a mutum, a bird. The ant goes into the mutum's nose, the mutum sneezes, and the shaman is transformed forever into a species of new and particularly nasty ant. But metamorphoses do not have to be caused by shamans either, as all kinds of beings, including the humblest of animals, can be responsible for transformations. When Kali, the Kutia, shows Macunaíma and his brothers where he found food, he gets stung by wasps, and that is why, the story tells us, his eyelids are swollen until today. When Macunaíma fells the big tree, Akuli, the squirrel who's helping him, lights a fire inside the tree hollow and burns his ear end. That is why the Kutia has a red bum. The little lizard, or lagartixa, helps Macunaíma's brother to cross the river when the latter is pursuing Piaiman by turning himself, that is, the lagartixa turns himself into a bridge. But in this case, he goes back to his original shape as a lizard. In other words, in all these stories, animals can be transformed because of their own action and desire. They can be protagonists of their own transformations, their own or other creatures' transformations, not simply the victims of metamorphosis. And transformation, in the case of these stories, is often a partial change to the animal's or plant's characteristics, so that the purpose of the theological tale is to explain particular features of this or that animal or plant. Metamorphosis, in these cases, seems to be closer to natural processes, what in our own etiological tales we would call evolution, than to stories about gods. They are, in this sense, more metonymical than metaphorical. In Ovid, the transformation into animal or plant eliminates the victim's capacity to speak. In the well-known story of Io, or Io, I don't know how it's said in English, Jove cannot control his desire for Io, but fearful that his wife Juno will discover his infidelity, he transforms the young woman into a cow. Io wanders off to her father's stream looking for sympathy, but as she tries to tell her father about her fate, she can only moo. And when she tries to embrace him, she's not understood. As Ferrer observes, I quote, "In fact, the girl's babbled attempt at communication becomes part of a set of human endeavors rendered impossible by her new form, the kind of clever catalogue that has made Ovid infamous. Each human pleasure yields a new bovine discomfort. Grass replaces food, earth takes the place of a bed, and muddy rivers provide her drink. Io acts as if she were human and finds that her new form beguiles and frightens her and frustrates her intentions," end of quote. Talking about another of such metamorphoses, the story of how Myrrha is transformed into a tree, Skolsky describes how, I quote, "Ovid powerfully succeeds in showing as a tragic monstrosity, a tree with a mind entirely given over to her inarticulate suffering," end of quote. But the suffering here is not the tree suffering. It's human suffering trapped in a tree form. We know nothing about the tree suffering or the cow suffering because the poem does not confer subjectivity to the tree or the cow. In fact, what characterizes them is that they have no point of view. By contrast, human-animal communication is the norm in the Pemon stories. Perhaps the best way to understand the importance of point of view in these stories is to look briefly at a kind of narrative that is very common in Amazonian storytelling traditions, the tale that recounts the marriage between species. Sorry, Felipe, you're going to hear it again. There are two of such stories in the Pemon collection. Neither of them is, strictly speaking, about metamorphosis, although they include some degree of transformation, and are, both of them, etiological narratives. The first story, The Visit to the Sky, reappears in very similar terms in various Amazonian cultures. A solitary man, Maichauli, is so lonely that he has to find a woman from another species, in this case, a vulture. The marriage works well until Maichauli is taken to visit his wife's home place in the sky. When the human and vulture couple arrive at the bride's house, she tells him that he does not have to drink what she and her family drink. He can find appropriate food in the parrot's house. Later in the story, when the groom meets his father-in-law, we are told why, and I quote, "He went to his father-in-law's house. Kasana Podoli gave him beer, made from all the rotten animals from the lake, fish, alligators, snakes, which were full of maggots. This, for the king vultures, is manioc beer. Instead of drinking it, he gave it all to his wife, who drank the beer. He drank corn beer from the parakeets, parrots, and macaws," end of quote. Also, as it always happens in these stories, the father-in-law becomes interested in eating his daughter's husband and sets up a series of impossible tasks for him to do. If he does not succeed, he will be eaten. The son-in-law manages to do the task with the help of different animals, and at the end he humiliates the father-in-law. Before leaving his in-laws, however, Maichauli steals, against the desire of his wife's family, a seed of corn, which he brings back to earth. In the second story, how the fish poisons Azar and Inag came to existence, obviously, as the title indicates, an etiological narrative, the second story describes the marriage between a female tapir and a human young man. At a certain point in the story, the tapir covered her lover's body with teaks because she saw them as pearl adornments. Later, the boy and his bride realized that they saw the world differently. I quote, "The boy found a rattlesnake and yelled, 'Careful, a snake,' and ran away. The tapir followed him. They stopped and said, 'Let's see.' They went back to the snake. Then the tapir said, 'This is not a snake, it's my stove,' just meaning the hot plate where they would make the manioc cakes. It's the form that looks like a steak. She explained, 'They say that snakes run after us to bite, but this is not a snake. For us tapirs, the dog is a snake. The dog runs after us, and when he bites, it hurts. The snake for us is a stove. Humans think it's a snake and suffer from its bite, in the same way we suffer from a dog's bite," end of quote. The realization that what I see as X, a particular animal sees as Y, is a formulaic device present in dozens of native stories from Amazonian and lowland South America more generally that describe the marriage between a human or proto-human character and a member of another species. This realization is at the core of Eduardo Viveiros de Castro's theoretical elaborations on what he calls perspectivism. Based on his own ethnographic fieldwork and that of other anthropologists, particularly Tânia Stolze Lima, Viveiros de Castro proposes that Amerindian Amazonian ontology is fundamentally distinct from our own. While for Western science, humans and animals share animality as their general denominator, in other words, we are all animals, in Amazonian Amerindian thought, described by Viveiros de Castro, the common denominator that links humans and animals is peopleness, or gentitude. I quote, "To say that animals and spirits are people is to say that they are persons. In other words, is to attribute to non-humans the capacity for conscious intentionality and agency, which enables them to occupy the enunciative position of subject," end of quote. In other words, it is to attribute to them a point of view. Perspectivism, however, as he explains, is not a form of relativism. I quote, "Perspectivism is not relativism, but multinaturalism. One culture, multiple natures. Perspectivism is not representation because representation belongs to the spirit, while points of view belong to the body. Only the soul has the potential to occupy a point of view, and humans are subjects inasmuch as they have or are spirits. The soul only sees the same thing everywhere. It's formally identical in every species. Difference is given by the specificity of the body." End of quote. In Ovid, the specificity of the body is understood in aesthetic terms, or insofar as it represents an obstacle for human expression. In the Pemon stories, the specificity of the body allows humans and animals, at this crucial formulaic moment of perspectivist epiphany, to realize that what one sees as one thing, the other may see as another entirely. Viveiros de Castro links these perspectivist revelations to an anxiety about cannibalism and the importance of hunting and fishing in lowland Amazonian societies. Elsewhere, as Felipe knows, I developed the argument that they are perhaps linked to food more generally. Both these stories are etiological narratives because they end with the development or domestication of new plants. In The Visit to the Sky, as we saw, the groom steals a seed of corn that he brings back to his village and becomes the corn that we still eat. In the tapir story, in a complicated series of events I have no time to recount here, the tapir and the human have a child whose body, when washed, produces a poison useful for fishing. Human and animal greed ends up having the boy killed, and his blood, when spilled onto the ground, gives origin to a new plant, the timbó, a poison used to stun fish. There is no obvious causal connection between the interspecies marriage and the etiological ending. But many, if not all, of such stories end precisely with the development of a new plant. In the case of the two stories that we are analyzing, they may be indeed, as Viveiros de Castro would claim, about cannibalism or predation, but they are equally a celebration of agriculture. The coming into being of a new plant is the other side of the coin of the anxiety about cannibalism or predation. If the perspectivist epiphany journey is about the awareness that hunting and fishing are part of an ever-dangerous contract between people, that is, human people and animal people, then agriculture, as it appears in these stories, offers a much necessary complement to this contract. In other words, the contract may indeed involve anxiety about cannibalism, but it also involves knowledge exchange between species, a major factor in the managing of the natural environment. Humans and animals constantly teach and help each other to transform and maintain the environment they are part of. They can also, of course, serve as obstacles or rivals in each other's attempts to transform the environment. All in all, humans, animals, and plants are connected through contracts that regulate the management of resources, including the management of themselves as resources. In order for these contracts to be exchanged, as it were, each species needs to see the other's point of view, or at least they need to understand that the world each other sees and inhabits is different from one's own. Like the Pemon narratives, Ovid's poem also proposes an idea of continuity, a flux that links humans and what we call natural phenomena. In Book 15, Pythagoras appears in the poem to proclaim that, I quote, "All things are ever changing. The spirit comes and goes, is housed wherever it wills, lifts residence from beasts to man, from man to beasts, but always it keeps on living," end of quote. According to this reading, wax is the spirit. I mean, I'm quoting further, I'm not quoting, but I'm mentioning bits from the same bit of the poem. Wax is the spirit, while the ever-changing bodies are the modes. As Marina Warner observes, Ovid developed in this poem an idiosyncratic Pythagorean view of the world, according to which, I quote, "souls inhabit everything, and human passions, erupting at moments of crisis, often transmute the very nature of nature. We are part of creation, also must suffer, change. We are not bodies only, but winged spirits with the power to enter animal houses," end of quote. The greatest difference between the two modes of metamorphosis is that while Ovid sees flux as a migration of spirit in which animals become houses for the trapped human spirit, the Pemon stories make humans and animals agents and signatories of pacts or contracts centered on bodily processes. Bodies provide the difference, while the spirit, gentitude, or the ability to have a point of view, is the shared element between animals and humans. At the same time, both works coincide in the way that metamorphosis can be used to describe their very logic of composition. As centuries of critics have pointed out, the form of Ovid's poem, which challenged both the Virgilian epic and the Alexandrian anti-epic traditions, is best described by the term metamorphosis, changing as it does from poem to poem, difficult as it is to define or secure. In the Pemon narratives, in turn, metamorphoses are punctuated by the importance of food and poison in the stories, as ultimate signifiers of the various transformative processes that link persons, humans, animals, spirit persons, to each other and to the environments that surround them. Finally, both collections of tales highlight the importance of etiology, that is, of narrative, as an explanation for natural phenomena. Viveiros de Castro has described the way in which, for Western societies, to know is to objectify the thing we want to know about. In contrast, he says, for Amerindian thought, knowledge is based on the subjectification or personification. Viveiros de Castro never says this, but personification is precisely the function of etiology, an attempt to imagine or find out the story of the rock, the biography of the jaguar, the reason why the squirrel looks the way he does. As for Ovid, 2,000 years later, critics are still debating whether etiology, in the case of his poem, is mere affectation, or it is as well a belief in the transformation of fabula as a form of knowledge that could counter, under the authoritarian regime of Augustus, the rigidity of the epic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucia. Are you working here with hyperfocal directional microphones? So I encourage everyone to speak directly into the microphone. Yes, that's right. So it's not a matter of dropping our batteries, it's a matter of the field of the microphone itself. So our next speaker is Pablo Gomez, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Medical History. There's a Department of Medical History. Wow. At the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His work examines the history of health and corporeality in the early modern Atlantic world. His forthcoming book, The Experiential Caribbean, Creating Knowledge and Healing in the Early Modern Atlantic, explores belief-making and the creation of evidence around the human body and the natural world in the early modern Caribbean. And that's what his presentation is about today. It's entitled, A Caribbean Natural History, Blacks, Amerindians, and the Creation of the New World.
Okay, can you hear me? Is this good? Well, thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Joss, for the intro. Thank you, Iris, Camila, and Felipe for the invitation. It's great being back here at the CAGAT, and a special thanks to Jordan for all the work putting together the conference. As Joss said, the material I'm going to be presenting today comes from my forthcoming book, and here comes the shameless plug. This is the cover of the book. I have some problems in the conversion of from the image to the PDF, so that is why it looks a little. The Pablo doesn't look complete and center, but and before I start talking about this comes from one of the chapters in the book, and I have another confession to make. I am somebody who is working primarily with the African diaspora in the Caribbean. But I thought that at least one of the episodes that I examine here touches, I think, in interesting topics about that I hope we can discuss, that we have been, I hear that you have been discussing over the past day, and I hope that is where we can see the connections. I am going to be discussing these spaces that in the 17th century became populated mostly by people of African descent. And this is not to say that the Amerindian populations, as it is kind of a trope in the history of the Caribbean, disappear, right? They are very much present in certain spaces that I examine, but in these villages, in these peasant towns and in big cities like Cartagena and Havana, as well as in the palenques, in the maroon settlements of, for instance, La Sierra La Maria or Matudere, people of African descent were the majority. By some accounts, percent of the population at this time was of African descent. And what I'm interested in here is seeing that encounter, a different kind of encounter that does not go through the European, that does not depend on that binary. How does it look like a history of the creation of knowledge about the natural world? What can we learn? And what are the strategies that we can use to do so? Yeah, it's really tricky, this thing. So this is also a region that it is interconnected, that is only in of people in Madrid or in Sevilla. It's a people where smuggling and where seaborne mobility also is the norm, including for people of African descent and communities. Several of these communities, I have to be said too, were also fragmented, were also decimated, and of course the emergence of encomiendas actually added to this, and I'm going to refer to that a little bit in the paper. So in a way, that is a region that doesn't really conform to some of the traditional frameworks that we have to for thinking about the colonial Latin America, and neither it does with some of the narratives that dominate the history of the Caribbean. When we think of the Caribbean, we usually think about those plantation societies of later of the 18th and 19th century, but this is a different space I hope you can see. In my work, I'm particularly interested in how, in kind of in the emergence of a Creole Caribbean culture that does not depend on all war epistemes, neither of African or European origin. So what happens of encounter, and what is how people actually think and create knowledge. And I think that this is important because the recognition of early modern Black and Amerindian Caribbean communities and their encounters allows us to see them as active receptors, shapers, and most importantly, acculturating agents. And it allows us, this is to paraphrase Roger Chartier, to concentrate on the concrete conditions and processes that actually construct meaning. How is this world, the world in which these people live, actually understood to the extent that we can access it, right? Like this is. So let me take you a little bit into the world that I've encountered, that I have today. So by the late 17th century, West Central African Antonio Congo had acquired fame as one of the most powerful ritual practitioners in the northern New Kingdom of Granada, what today is Colombia. He was an expert in manipulating the variety of physical and spiritual elements populating the natural landscape of the Caribbean. According to his neighbors in Cartagena de Indias, around 1680, Antonio communicated with spiritual entities that he called his people by uttering incomprehensible words. Antonio played a tamborico, small drum, all night, to the rhythm of which, he said, his people danced. In the minds of his neighbors, the West Central African effectively linked the sound of his drums and his voice to the presence of spiritual entities. Those neighbors declared that at night, Antonio spoke as if accompanied by them. Antonio emphasized that in these rites, this is in his words, he was communicating with Amerindians that populated the underground of his shack. He said that this was a cementerio de caciques, it was a cemetery of Amerindian chiefs. The same ones to whom he made continuous offerings in the form of food bites and alcohol that he threw on the ground. So, and these are his words too, they help him in his rituals and healing procedures. He also thought, or he also knew how to control them. When witnesses and Antonio himself said in 1690 that these Congo ritual practitioners was able to drive hurricanes back to the sea, but they meant in all likelihood was the original meaning of the word in Taino, that is gods of storms. And actually, Antonio himself made a specific reference when he was talking to how is that he was able to manipulate the hurricane, when he said that he was actually manipulating, controlling an anima. This is the transcriptions of the Spanish scribes. An anima, a spirit that are actually fueling the storm. So it's something that is very much in his mind. At the same time that Antonio is doing this, he's actually making visible and creating for that community one word in which natural events were directly linked in an evident manner to a physical and a spiritual community that was largely composed of people of African descent, but also of Amerindian physical and spiritual communities. I'm interested in seeing how that community and that word come from these bodily practices and how this actually becomes what I believe is the basis for the formation of peasant societies in that century, in the 17th century. So in the paper, I briefly analyze the strategies that practitioners like Antonio Congo use for the creation of experiences and knowledge about the natural world. So specifically in this presentation, as I said before, I found some of the examples that I found in my research between those encounters, between African and Caribbean Amerindian communities. Many of these practitioners, by the way, it is not going to be the case with examples that I'm going to present today because I wanted to present that kind of contrast between the Africans specifically, but many of them were Criollos actually, people born in the Caribbean. These rarely examined encounters are part of some of the evidence that I propose to kind of change our ways of thinking about sensing and being in the early modern Atlantic. And this is important because I think that defining how the world can be felt also makes fundamental claims about its nature. It theorizes the world. Sensing is not only a one initial step in perceiving reality, but also organizes it. Early modern Black Caribbean ritual practitioners intensely fashion what Maurice Merleau-Ponty has called forms of being in the world. It was in these new sensorial landscapes that their experientially based projects became rooted. And it is true, as I said before, that as in the Caribbean, as in the rest of the New World, Amerindian and African ritual practitioners were also deeply implicated in the gathering of sensorial information of the world that was later included and obfuscated, as we know very well, in European scientific projects. African Amerindians and their descendants, however, this is what I want to emphasize, they were not only very good sensors of a specific types of knowledge like geography, flora, and fauna to be translated and incorporated into Western taxonomies, and this is something that has been explored at length in the historiography. I'm interested in a different form of thinking about that knowledge. In the Caribbean, health practitioners competed over who had the authority to explain and manipulate human bodies and define how reality could be felt. And this is because all of these practitioners strongly emphasize the aspects of their practices that were specifically related to what could be felt. Black ritual practitioners could not only rely, as any one of these, in the authority that birth-giving or ritually ascribed abilities granted them over dead communities. And this is particularly true in the Caribbean, where we have the flux of communities come from all over the Atlantic and where multiple Amerindian and African languages were spoken, and where European languages did not really function as linguas francas, as a lingua franca. Spanish reports from Panama in 1607 speak to a situation common all over the place. Quote, and this is a report from one of the bishops, "There are no Indians in the city. Spaniards speak the Castilian language. The blacks among themselves. Those from each land speak their own language." He's talking about the Africans. They also speak Castilian, but very poorly, except those who are Creoles. And they even those speak something that was called Spanish Castilian. And this is also evident in several reports that we have about healing procedures and manipulation of the natural world coming from places like Cartagena. Antonio, for instance, his witnesses spoke in a language that nobody could understand. In Congo, where deep currents of criminal meaning flowed through the social landscape, the pattern of Antonio's words carried particular significance related to social afflictions. However, these words often failed to resonate with audiences, these multicultural audiences in Caribbean lands. So in the paper that I sent, I provide several examples of similar situations where Black practitioners repeatedly use, quote, words that nobody could understand in their procedures, and yet those procedures were powerful nonetheless, and this proved normative in Caribbean spaces. The paper also described how Amerindian ritual practitioners like Piaches in Cumaná, what today is Venezuela, as I said before, did not disappear actually, and remain central points of reference for these imaginaries about power over nature. And as I also mentioned how in the paper, how as in other Atlantic locales, the Caribbean, Spanish and Portuguese Caribbean physicians and surgeons also resorted to the knowledge for the practices themselves. So kind of part of that well-known narrative about incorporation of the natural world. They actually made references specifically to potions like Ambire or El Bálsamo de Tolú or Limpiadientes that they actually, they're in published treatises in Spain, published in Sevilla and in Madrid. Black Caribbean ritual practitioners' reliance on felt experiences during encounters with Amerindian groups was to be expected, given, as I said before, that they typically spoke no Native American languages, and in many cases not even Castilian. And we have example after example of people living for 20 years in the Caribbean that did not know how to speak Spanish. They didn't, and this idea of Catholicism also is a central space, at least in the was not, central space of encounter was not necessarily true. Many of these people appear after, again, decades in front of the Inquisition, where probably would be better to know how to cross yourself and saying someone without. And language discordances were also the norm in these Indian towns. When explaining the animosities between different groups in the Indian town of Chenú, located east of Cartagena, for instance, Fray Diego Becerra wrote in 1612 that, quote, there are constant brawls and fights between the Indians because they are from different tongues, and this is in his demeaning words, people without reason. The case of Francisco Mandinga, and I'm going to concentrate in this case that I think is exemplary of some of the process I examined in the paper, provides a good example of the dynamics in these communities. By all accounts, was one of the most prodigious creators of the sensorium of the northern New Kingdom of Granada. Several main charges brought against him in 1664 during his second Inquisition involved healing practices he performed on his journeys to some of the same towns that Fray Becerra described, and which peppered the northern New Kingdom of Granada. Francisco's cures depended on his ability to identify the presence of evil and spells on his patients. Around 1655, Francisco was summoned to the town of Tolú, some 100 miles south of Cartagena, to treat several cases local suspected were the work of Indios yerbateros. Francisco arrived in Tolú after being hired by, quote, a person who had some Indians sick of yerbas and who suspected that one of them, an Indian woman called Leonor, was the culprit. The person who summoned Francisco, as it was customary in these sort of records, remained unnamed, but most likely it should be one of the many encomenderos that appear in 17th century judicial and Inquisition records as having hired black healers. So remember, this is an encomendero that is hiring a West Central African from Cartagena and bringing him to cure his Native Americans, the ones that were supposedly under his custody in Tolú. And the other thing is, in Francisco's case, the employer has also worked closely alongside an unnamed Indian chief that also is mentioned as one of the witnesses in the process as somebody that actually is resorting to the authority of Francisco Mandinga. After arriving in Tolú, Francisco ordered the previous healer, Leonor, and her son apprehended. He then proceeded to examine the prisoners. He made them quote, open their hands and stick out their tongues, which he palpated with his finger. And after physically examining mother and son in front of the community, and all of these procedures have to be emphasized, are being done in front of the community, he declared that Leonor was a yerbatera and a rogue, but that her son was somebody who really did not understand Arabs. He then proceeded to inspect Leonor's bohío, her shack, where he stayed looking all over the place. He then demanded that water be thrown by a payute, from which he took out a pot of yerbas, of herbs, making essentially evident the cause of the multiple incidents of disease that were occurring in Tolú. In reports from the regions are to be believed, Francisco was a very busy man. When speaking of problems of integrating different Indian communities in the northern New Kingdom of Granada, Fray Becerra, that I mentioned before, stated in 1614 that, quote, it is public knowledge that those in different repartimientos kill each other with yerbas. At the same time, the overseer of the encomienda in Momila and other towns said the same thing about the Indian inhabitants of Tofeme and Chenú, another two towns. He said, quote, when they are not fighting, they avenge their anger by resorting to yerbas and spells with which they kill each other. And Indeed, after hearing about the effectiveness of Francisco's cures in Toulouse, the report said actually that epidemic that was happening in Toulouse disappeared. Other, quote, Indians of towns around Toulouse came and asked him to cure them. And this is in the record also of Francisco's process. So in the paper, I go on to describe similar healing rituals that Francisco performed in those other Amerindian communities. I don't have time to, but I'll be happy to speak at length about them in the Q&A. In all of these cases, however, I can say that Francisco's diagnostic rights depended almost exclusively on embodied performance that made little, if any, use of verbal signifiers. In one telling example from around 1663, Francisco resorted in his attempts to cure a certain person, as it was mentioned in the records, treated with some herbs that he had cooked that he called herbs of Santa Maria. So after the water was black, he was the part of the patient where she was experiencing pain and applied a sucker, a ventosa, which he took out blood, making visually and tangibly visible the nature of that evil that he was expelling. In another case, Francisco went through the house of a sick person and, quote, started venting with his nose while walking around the house. Considering what was at stake here, claims about the very nature of the war and how it could be sensed, Spanish authorities attempted to limit the contact between black and Native American communities through prohibitions like the ordenanzas issued by the Audiencia de Santa Fe, Javier de Villabona, on April 11, 1611. And remember, this is the people that are in charge of the administration of the Audiencia, not necessarily those who are actually living there, like the encomenderos or the people in the repartimientos. So these ordenanzas were intended to manage the Indian population around Cartagena, and two of these decrees were justified under the veneer of Christianization, and specifically banned Indians from serving as muleteers in the villages of Mateo and Malambo, again in that area around Tolu and Chenu, and it also prohibited Amerindians from being anywhere close to the city of Cartagena de Indias during the arrival of armadas and galleon fleets, because, quote, of the damages that the company of black and black muleteers caused to their morals. Furthermore, blacks were prohibited from living with Indians for similar reasons. But these policies, as it was the case in so many other Spanish places in the world, had little effect in these Caribbean hinterlands, where encounters between black populations, including Maroons, free blacks, and slaves working in haciendas and in mines, and Native Americans, were the norm rather than the exception. Another black slave, Pedro de Mesa Namboa, Pedro Congo, made similar remarks about the type of smelling that Francisco used during the 1680s. Pedro had earned a reputation around the savannas near the towns of Mompox and Zaragoza for, quote, being a great Mohan who could transform himself into a tiger. Those of you who are Colombian here or have lived in Colombia know that Mohan is a specific reference to a word of Amerindian origin. And this is the Spanish scribes talking about, again, West Central African ritual practitioners. They refer to powerful ritual practitioners, but also to spiritual entities. And in this case, I think that also talks about how that intersection between the Amerindian and the African is very much present in the imaginary of the world. And in the words of the Spanish scribes, and this is in a couple of references in the Inquisition records, they talk about them as masters de hechiceros, master of sorcerers. But it was also a reference. Not everybody was a Mohan. It's also a recognition of power, right? There is a rank. Not every, you have brujas, but you have Mohanes. In the paper, I describe how, among other procedures, this Mohan, Pedro claimed that he was able to cure belly obstructions with water of the roots of the escovilla bush, and bee's honey, a concoction that also included, and this is important, the stomach, skin, and feather of a bird called cocoli. In all likelihood, this is referring to the cocoli bird, a native of the savannas of the northern New Kingdom of Granada. And in 1688, witnesses remarked on the process that Pedro followed to locate the bird. They said that he went around the forest, around Mompox, smelling for the bird when looking for it. And tellingly, this is important also because the inquisitors actually remarked upon the fact that he was using a very specific type of smelling. It was not only like inhaling fragrant substances that we are used to in the Inquisition process, and one of the kind of causes for his prosecution. Cocoli, by the way, is also an anonym that refers to specific groups in Upper Guinea at the same time. Alonso Sandoval a Jesuit that wrote one of the first treatises, Speak, also talks about it. And this is the final case that I have for you. This is another example of that encounter between the physical and the spiritual communities and how it kind of becomes integrated even within what I consider were technological artifacts. And this is something that, I was discussing before with Marcy. This is a West African healer, Antonio Juan Muneoi Arara, who communicated with Amerindian energies populated in northern New Andalusia's Numinous realm. In the paper, I detail some of the procedures he performed. Quote, later one night, one of the witnesses in the process, in the Inquisition process, said that he heard, quote, a maraca, and somebody singing in a low voice. The witnesses then heard Antonio Juan pronouncing the word Huami, Huami, Huami. This is something that he was doing throughout the night. And the next morning they asked him what it was he playing the maracas and singing at such hours. To this, Antonio Juan answered that he was, quote, calling the demon, and this is the way it is transcribed, of course, in the Inquisition records, in the language of the Indio. This is calling the demon in the language of the Indio. And the term demon here obviously is most likely a catch call, that term that ritual practitioners like Antonio Juan used during his Inquisition process to encompass a diverse set of spiritual entities. And in many cases, as a matter of fact, and this is the case of Antonio Juan, it was through translators. These people are speaking in their own languages. The Jesuit College in Cartagena had translators for 70 African languages. The records, in fact, that demonstrate that Antonio Juan thought very differently, that these were not really demons, but those luminous entities that he was invoking with Amerindian words. He said that the spirit, quote, had not arrived until it was almost done, and that he had captured it in the said maraca, where he would hold him until all of his people were healthy, end quote. So Antonio Juan obviously is drawing on a vast repository of communal spiritual resources that black practitioners like him recognize present, but also they are creating a new and making visible of that fragmented corpus of people arriving in Caribbean lands. He captured the power of Native American numinous entities and channeled them through his technique. In this case, power objects, in the case of the maraca, with seemingly verifiable West African inspiration, but I will say that are being reimagined, reconstructed in Caribbean spaces in order to heal. The creation of a sensorial space in which such connections were audibly and visually evident proved critical in holding these spiritual communities together. This is because the manner in which bodies fill the world is intimately engaged with the production of cultural values. So let me conclude by saying that, and this is kind of a part of the conversation, and I think it talks to your paper, Lucia, is this, unlike those cannibal savages and brutes that Michel de Montaigne depicts as having no sciences, and therefore never really perceived war, 17th century Caribbean black Mandinga, Antonio Juan Arara, or Antonio Congo possess their own understanding of what constitute real hechos, real facts. Moreover, those healers were specialists in describing the social and the spiritual in the experiential. The boundaries of their factual words were located in different dominions than those of their European contemporaries. Black Caribbean Mohanis produced an embodied language that made the natural world perceivable through their teeth, hands, mouth, hearts, and skin. It was in the creation of a saturating realm of felt experiences that the language of Caribbean Atlantic realities was birthed. In their instantiating rites and procedures, Black Mohanis defined, argued, and made the natural world and bodies of the Caribbean felt alive. In early modern European representations of the other, the intellectual maneuver de rigueur is the distancing. Because the others did not have access to reality, they could be fooled or enslaved. In the same intellectual, and this is paraphrasing Natalie Simon Davis, because these others did not have access to reality, they could be fooled or enslaved. In these same intellectual transactions that created patterns of exchange and established the facts on which the West and the new science would emerge, these others had to be essentially stunned. Their experiences have to be dismissed in the constructions of projects that legitimize colonizations and intellectual and cultural subjugation. But I'm interested in something else, right? It is how these communities actually, and the cases that I present here, I believe allow us to recognize that these languages, stories of knowledge production, we cannot see them as based on categories of sensual otherness, is these are not manifestations of cultural phenomena uniquely intended to represent, mimic, or react against socially dominant ways of knowing and social hierarchies. These are the dominant ways of thinking and understanding that world. Black Caribbean ritual practitioners created new manners of sensing the world and signifiers for what could be perceived. In doing so, they defined the broad sensorial boundaries of the natural world in which the noble Caribbean healing cultures of the 17th century ensued. In short, early modern black bodies and how they felt the world, not the least because of their sheer numbers, were that existential and cognitive basis. By creating a scenario in which references to invisible and inaudible energies could be perceived, Black Caribbean ritual practitioners expanded the limits of the sensoriums that contain the Caribbean world. For their communities, these mohanis were the intellectual forces that classify, explain, and define the nature of how bodies work and what could be sensed, and the experiences around which these realities could be described. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Pablo. So I believe that I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Josh Tucker. I'm a professor of music here at Brown. My work focuses on music, sound, and transformations in indigenous experience in the South Peruvian Andes. And I've been asked to respond to Lucia and Pablo's presentations. I'll keep things brief so that we don't run long on time and we can actually have questions for our presenters. I'm very happy, though, to see that people are touching on two domains that are central to my own work, the nature of indigeneity on the one hand, and the nature of sensory experience and the role that the senses play in constructing that sort of experience on the other. Especially glad to see people taking seriously alternative phenomenologies, alternative modes of dividing the socio-natural continuum. In constructing worlds that are different from our own and that often are overlapping with or coextensive with our own, which is one of the things that I think the long chapter gets at very well. Start with Lucia's paper. I'm glad to see somebody trying to apply Viveros de Castro's work in a context far from the indigenous Americas, trying to assess its worth or its possible application outside of that context. That, in a sense, is kind of an extension of Viveros de Castro's own impulse, right? He's constantly making these sort of grand claims for his own work as having relevance far beyond the Amazonian context, sometimes perhaps overreaching in that sense. But more properly, it seems to me like it's a really good extension of Descolat's extension of Viveros de Castro's work. Descolat builds on Viveros de Castro by trying to classify all of the world's indigenous socio-natural systems, coming up with a four-part division into which they can all be classified, and thereby extend it beyond the specificities of the American context. And I've always wondered about this in Descolat's work. Like, he doesn't really specify how he draws the boundaries of indigeneity. He just sort of assumes that indigenous is already transparent, and then he puts all the world's indigenous peoples into this, four-part system that he has for analyzing social-natural collectives. Well, especially since the notion of who is and is not indigenous in Viveros de Castro's work seems to rest on the Cartesian moment, right? The binary of human and non-human, self and other. There's a lot of people who come before that who might properly be regarded as fitting into Descolat's system. So what happens? What would happen if we looked at ancient Greece, ancient Rome, all of these other places where there do seem to be alternative approaches to what you're talking about, metamorphosis, or relations between the human and the natural, and so on. And of course, you draw it very well, the very reason that Ovid's sense of what it means to change, to metamorphosize, is kind of the opposite of what Viveros de Castro is getting at. It actually renders people unable to communicate. It takes away their sensory capacities and takes away their ability to communicate, thus making clear the radical difference between the social-natural system of lowland Amazonia and the ancient world. I'll admit that, my nearly complete ignorance of classics limits my ability to ask questions about Ovid. But I did want to follow up a little bit on one of the last things that you mentioned, the various transformative processes that link persons, human, animal, and spirit persons, to each other and to the environments that surround them. That touches directly, of course, on the reason that people like Viveros y Castro and Descola have become so popular outside of the world of indigenous studies, right? Something that we saw in the discussion of the film yesterday, actually. This image of ecological harmony and environmental stewardship that seems to be implied in Viveros y Castro's system is, of course, very attractive to a number of people around the world who are working on the environmental emergency in which we find ourselves. So I'd like to sort of ask an impossible and ridiculous question here. Do we know very much about the state of those relationships in the ancient world? I mean, can we make ties between Ovid's sense of, human ownership over the environment, human harnessing of the environment, and the stance toward human and natural relations? I know that's a ridiculous question, but if anybody's looking for a dissertation topic, it seems like a really wide open, good area. Although you have to have a lot of skills. Okay, so moving on to Pablo's paper, I really like the way that the other kinds of interconnectedness appear in this paper, here mostly between human populations, in addition to human and natural collectives. And for want of a better term, connections to the supernatural. And we all know that term is iffy and misapplied in a lot of contexts, but we don't yet have a very good word in English to cover the terrain that we used to cover with the supernatural, right? Invisible nature, or things that are not tangible to non-specialists. It puts me in mind of Ana Maria Ochoa's recent work, her book Orality, and that in turn suggests the sort of durable nature of the kinds of things you're talking about. So you're talking about a different moment than she is, the early modern moment, the early colonization of the Caribbean. She's largely focusing on the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And she also specifically evokes Viveros y Castro and perspectivism in accounting for the puzzlement that European travelers were faced with when they were looking at the rowers on the Magdalena River in Colombia, right? These Afro-descendant bogas who were responsible for poling ships, boats up the river, carrying travelers like Alexander von Humboldt, as well as a number of others. All of whom are making these sounds that are completely uninterpretable to Humboldt. Even somebody as radically democratic, abolitionist, and just intelligent as Humboldt is just defeated by trying to understand these sounds because they don't fit any system that they can figure out. They don't seem to be African in origin. They don't seem to be indigenous in origin. They don't seem to be mixed or hybrid, which is another alternative framework. They just seem to be doing things that are very difficult to understand. And you get these debates, so are these human sounds, or are they animal sounds? Are these people human, or are these people more like animals? Are these, if we decide they're human, are these sounds music, or are they noise? In which case, if they're noise, they're closer to animality than humanity. And it's this wonderful moment when those four categories, music, sound, human, and animal, are being defined in relation to one another. But what she sets at the center of this whole system is precisely the kind of thing you're talking about, the overlap between indigenous socio-natural systems and African understandings of those socio-natural systems. And basically makes the argument that a lot of what these sounds are doing is becoming means through which people dialogue with and inhabit the subject position of the animals and the plants that surround the boat as they pole them up the river. So, to bring that back to your paper, the paper at hand, we see something similar here in your attempt to register the sensory domains through which early Afro-Caribbeans and those around them, the way that they developed a sensory apparatus for handling a world in flux around them. And especially nice to hear about smell. This is one of these things that is a permanent feature for historians of the senses, right? Why don't we have any histories of smell? I mean, aside from the obvious reasons that smells don't last very long, and so, it's very hard to do a history of smell. We have Corbin's Foul and the Fragrant, but other than that, we don't have all these histories of smell or taste that might accompany our really kind of extensive literature on the history of sight and sound. It also might be added to that there are other ways of thinking about the histories of sensory apparatus that we don't have. That is to say, histories of a sensory apparatus that is not divided into the 5 categories that we have in the West. You call some attention to that in your paper. Even within the West, proprioception, balance, all these other sensory domains that are not exactly accounted for in our 5-part division, those are missing. So it's very admirable to see a project that is trying to do that, but of course it's challenging for the reason I've already said. It's very difficult to get the evidence. It's always second-order evidence, right? Interpreting somebody's interpretation. So the question that I'm sort of left with after reading your work the kind of question that is unfair to ask like a graduate student or a recent doctoral student or something like that, but I think is totally fair to ask somebody who has a book that's about to come out from a prestigious press, is, you know, you suggest, yeah, right. It's a different level. Early modern black bodies and how they felt the world were the existential and cognitive basis of early modern Caribbean cultures of knowing the world. What is the legacy after the early modern moment? I mean, what happens after that moment? What's the legacy in the present day? And one of the reasons that I ask is that you cite Ochoa, another Ochoa's work on Palo in Cuba, which is very, very interesting. Another thing that your chapter very much put me in mind of course, is Stefan Palmier's work on mestizaje and so on in 19th century Cuba. So what is the legacy? I mean, can we trace a legacy of this sort of early modern Afrocentric, but perhaps also indigenous-centric sensorial hexus in the present day? And I will leave my comments at that so that we can have questions from the floor.
Is this working? Yeah? Well, thank you for the comments. I'm not a classicist. I really can't. I ventured into this in a kind of a mad impulse, and I have been reading a lot of criticism of it and getting into that world. But to claim that I would know about the concept of relationship between humans and nature would be false. What the commentators on Ovid do say, however, is that Ovid incorporates a lot of the scientific language of the time when describing nature. So in some of his descriptions of metamorphosis, for instance, particularly related to plants and birds, there are moments in which when the bird being metamorphosized, changing, is described, the bird often is described in flight as it changes, and that process of description incorporates some of what would be the scientific language about nature of the time. And a lot of the commentators on Ovid, because nobody really knows very much what to do with this poem, and it's very admired, but it's also very debated, and to what degree Ovid, what was he trying to do with it. And on the one hand, he says, these are lies, he never believes they were true. At the same time, because of his use of scientific language at certain moments, and because of his almost clinical description of the pain of the humans, particularly the women, when they are trapped, for instance, in the body of a cow, etc., that description of suffering, how actually realistic it is, even though the genre of the poem would be the fabula, it would be a lie. So what I tried to do when reading it was focus on the descriptions of nature like systematically and take very copious notes, but in order to answer your question, I would then to read other texts from the time and have a much broader view of what those texts said about nature, which I can't claim to know. As for the use of Viveiros de Castro, I just would like to say that I think if the popularity is based on an idea of harmony, that idea itself is a bit problematic, because that's not what he proposes at all. I think the whole issue, it proposes an ontology or a view of the, and Descola as well, propose a view of, a world view, or a view of phenomena that is, or proposes to be, or tries to defend the idea they're different, that there are differences at least from the way we see phenomena. But that doesn't mean that necessarily harmonious, and it's quite scary, actually, some of the, views of the perspectivist view, and the fear, the permanent fear of being devoured, etc. It points to a world that's actually quite full of danger. So harmony is not a word I would necessarily use, although the relationship with nature is different, and the role of agency or the agency of animals points to obviously different ways of relating, yeah, which is not necessarily harmonious,
Right.
but
Yeah.
it's, you
I mean,
know.
to be clear, like, I don't mean to say that Viveiros de Castro takes
Yeah.
that view, but as I think we all know, very often a scholar's work is taken up in a rather glib fashion
Yeah.
by other people.
Yeah.
I definitely think that is a feature
Yeah.
of a lot of the uses of Viveiros de Castro's work.
Yeah.
that's being used.
No, I agree with that, yeah. Okay.
So I'm going to keep this brief so we can hear from everybody else. But obviously, right, this is one of the chapters in the book. In the larger project, I developed, right, a couple of the chapters actually deal specifically with what sort of specific ways producing knowledge, in this case based on the experiential, actually are reproduced in the Caribbean. And I think this, as you said correctly, and I'm very glad that you identified Todd, for instance, or Palmier as somebody that, people that have influence in my work, in the way in which I think the Caribbean, the problem of the criollo, right, the problem of what is Creole is so hard to grasp in places like the New Kingdom of Granada, like Colombia. And then when we think about that kind of, that blackness, right, in these spaces, or even in the Cuba of the 17th century, I think that we can make the mistake of trying to identify, and this has been the tradition that we see in history of the African diaspora, in trying to identify specifically works of continuity, right? And that is something that can be done and very effectively and for good purposes, right, in spaces that came to define the region later in the 18th and 19th century because of specific patterns of migration. But then the creativity and the ways in which these people started producing knowledge, and the way they actually, and this is something that actually, to answer your question directly, how this gets, immersed in the way in which Caribbean culture becomes that, has that ability to incorporate, to create knowledge from places that are coming from all the world, from all these flows of information that are not necessarily identifiable, or that we should not even try to think of in terms of all world epistemes. The other thing that I also go a little bit of length also in the manuscript is how to understand the early modern world. And this is also paraphrasing Rain Dasson, right? Like the problems of thinking about the early modern world as something that can only be understood, of only means something as it's related to modern, right? So it's the modernity with all the isms, right? It's not only that we know very well modernity is partially a fiction, right? But it's also how you create a of the Atlantic that are not necessarily centered around histories of capitalism, scientism, or reaction or relationship to it. How can you imagine the construction, again, of epistemological projects that are productive, that are effective, and that are meaningful for these communities in the centuries that ensue? And this is something that you can see. I'm very aware and I guess very afraid of making a commitment, right, to those links, precisely because this is so ephemeral. But what I do believe, what remains is that praxis of incorporation that we see in these examples, and that I just portray in the book, right, like, very clearly. And I think that is the power of the criollo, right? It doesn't seem to fit so well in the other narratives that we're so accustomed to. And I think that is part of what the book is also trying to make an intervention in. Like, there are other ways that recognize something that is powerful emerging there. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you both for wonderful talks. I wanted to say something about Lucia's talk, and probably connected to Paulo's, just to focus on knowledge, community, and globality in general. It's fantastic, Lucia, how you see etiology, also etiological thinking, as a way of making sense of globality. It seems to me that ethnography is a sort of meaning-making process or community-making device that creates a certain sort of knowledge, a certain type of knowledge that divides us from them, creates a past, is instrumental to frontier-making. And etiological thinking is different in that way. It's more nomadic, transformative, includes, gives agency to many things. Ethnography objectifies, trying to be very schematic. But my question would be, seeing Ovid as a sort of etiological thinker, but also Amazonian narratives as well. What do you see any traces of ethnography in etiology? Is etiology also, etiological thinking also captures ethnography, or is it only one way around? Or what are the contact zones between etiology and ethnography? I don't know if there are, probably in Koch Grünberg there's something.
Yeah, it's a good question. Because I think since I was focusing on etiology that explain etiological narratives, plots or subplots that explained the natural world, I wasn't really paying attention to the stories that will explain why a culture is or these or those people are the way they are. And of course that exists, and in fact in the case of one commentator that I did mention about of Ovid's poem says that in general terms etiology was more used in antiquity to explain cultural facts. So therefore, your own culture, but other people's culture, or cities, why is that city that way, etc. So yes, there would be clearly an overlap there. In the case of Koch Grünberg, the narratives themselves, because the narratives, I can't remember any case now, but it could easily happen that it could explain why the Maku are the way they are. You know, a certain story would explain things that way, which you could, you know, with a stretch, perhaps in that case, think of it as a more, maybe what we would call now ethnographic. It's a I don't know, it's such a modern term, isn't it, that is difficult in that way. But yeah, I could imagine if what we're trying to understand is how to explain another culture, perhaps. Yeah, I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah, but would you think that ethnographic thinking creates a different community than ethnologic thinking, or are they two different sorts of community-making narratives? Or do you see that difference is not workable? It's not possible to think about different communities through these different sorts of narratives. I don't know if I'm making sense. I'm trying just to touch on how the way we narrate the world makes, how we conceptualize knowledge creates different communities of human and non-human.
Yeah, it depends on how we see the ethnological and the etiological in that way. I think if I was very interested in the narrative itself and how to, you know, almost how do we invent a story? Look at this and how is it that it came here? Well, this is, you know, it came here because, and we invent a story about that, or we find out what the story is. We have to remember that these stories, the Koch Grünberg stories, are shamanic stories. They're all shamanic stories. And therefore, this process of not all the stories there are shamanic stories, sorry, but the stories that talk about the marriage between species they all are, because they will talk about the trip, a journey, you know, to know, or about a journey to another world, as it were, a negotiation between a character and the father of, you know, the animals, or so it's a negotiation between worlds. So they are, in that sense, shamanic stories, and we can't forget that as well. I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I find these two presentations very interesting. I think that might be a connection between both in what I'm going to say, because somehow etiology is a kind of anthropology, reverse anthropology. I think that we are pointing towards something which is at the core of Amerindian conceptions of knowledge, this comes out from narratives and connects with practices of what we call as sorcery or shamanism, and this also produces conceptions of landscape and memory and spaces, because it's how people identify the origins of and formations of specific places, and also, of course, the origins of white people. So there is always an explanation about the origins, and which means that you are able to think about them and control them. Because you control by process of formation, everything, including white people and its technology and etc. So I think you're pointing towards something which is at the core of these conceptions of knowledge. And perhaps there you can find a difference between something which become literalized throughout modern times, since our ancient sources and so on, with something which is active, which is actually a practice of knowledge, which is very active nowadays. You know. Some comments, not a question, actually.
Yeah, I have a question for Pablo. I think your emphasis on corporeality and embodiment is really compelling. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more actually about where it sits vis-a-vis language, because it strikes me we could similarly pluralize our understanding of the function of language here, not just to denote, but also to evoke and invoke, and also to play a kind of performative function as much as immediately. And to provoke, sure, why not one more? And I'm just thinking too about the transmission of knowledge and the varieties of ways that language might function there, particularly when thinking about necessarily permanent bodies of knowledge and their relationship to what might come after.
Excellent. Thank you, Jennifer. Certainly so, right. And again, it is because in this chapter I'm specifically focusing on these sort of practices. Language, as I said before, and that is what I may reference to this almost Babylonian world in which these people are living, becomes a way in which certainly some of these, all these experiential instances become indexed, right? And there is a way in which words like Mohana, and that is what I also made reference to these specific terms, because they come to signify and to encompass, right, that different reality. And this is something that becomes very important when you are reading, right, this sort of process, and in how do you read them, right, in a way that does not necessarily impose a certain type of narrative within those terms. It's certainly, I mean, they're produced, right, by the Inquisition. There is no doubt about it. They're produced by Spanish authorities in the case of notarial records or governmental records. But what it is behind, what do these, and in that sense, these records are also unique because of the place that Cartagena has, and it was one of only 3 Inquisition places in the New World, right? But it's the place in the Americas where African or people of African descent will actually appear within days, right, in front of the Inquisition, in which you actually have African translators, just going more directly to your question, to give it those voices. We have very few, if any, documents that are comparable in the 17th century, where you can actually hear, again, with all the problems of it is ventriculized, it is coming through the filter of the Inquisition, but actually says something about what they are saying. At the same time that we have words of African origin, right, that we can identify and we can do a linguistic analysis. So in that way, they also become that source for that African history. But what I'm trying to point out here is that one has to be very careful, right, with what words mean in that space, right? Precisely because, and this relates to what you were saying, they become inscribed in a certain way of thinking and defining the world. And the type of process that we have here do not get captured, right? Necessarily, at least in the printed, or at least in those records. That is not to say, and you're correctly saying something that I didn't have time to say it in the paper, but I actually said here in the presentation, saying in the paper is that, of course, words are more than actually just pointing out to something that is signified. Is the sound, right, actually, and this actually goes to that beautiful anecdote of the Bogas in the Magdalena. What are the words that are being brought up in those sounds? So in that regard, they also kind of function as indexes of a different sort, right? Not necessarily as those linguistic indexes, right?
I have a question for each. Thank you so much for such rich papers. I'll go with Lucia first. experience working on communities for a while, a few people have suggested that I go to Ovid and go to more visits, and I haven't taken the challenge yet, so I'm so glad to have a little insight of how that looks like. But I also remember one question that I get often, and I want to pose it to you and see where you land here. They often get asked kind of to situate my work in this, or versus this uncomfortable trope that indigenous cultures are the past of Europe. And in your work, I mean, putting these two types of texts together, the similarities in the narratives and the evocations, and would give apparently some credence to this type of trope. Where do you stand in that? And how do you position yourself there?
Well, thank you for asking that question. I think a lot of the, when I asked the question, when I was asked that question, I think what was I would say in the people's minds was often that, you know, that idea that native Amazonian is similar to the past of Europe, and like you, I feel extremely uncomfortable with that. And that's why I thought I'd look. At the same time, that I don't think one can accept that as, you know, as a fact or as a given. The fact that Greco-Roman antiquity had trickster characters that perhaps are similar in some ways to some of the trickster characters that we find, say, in the Americas, I think opens the possibility of comparisons. You also have societies which were not guided by monotheistic religions, and the non-monotheistic religions have perhaps some similarities, although they also have lots of differences. So I think my take when I decided to do it, having done Complete, etc., and having, you know, read of it, was, well, why not? Let's look, and hoping that I would find differences as I would perhaps find similarities. And there are clear differences, and I think at the same time there are similarities, and I don't believe that native Amazonia is the past of Europe. I don't believe the positivistic, you know, kind of narrative, definitely not. At the same time, as human societies, we do have a lot of links, and I think Greco-Roman antiquity and Greco-Roman stories, and some of those stories that have been retold by our own literature up to these days, and with so many similarities to Western literature, there are clearly similarities, why not, with some of the texts, the stories, the ways of narrating of the Amazon. That doesn't mean that, you know, they are the past of Europe. I don't know if that, yeah. Mm.
Thank you. Excited to hear you frame your project as an expansion of the sensorial field in the Caribbean. I think that's a fascinating idea, and I am curious about how you feel about the potential of telling your case in a moment like today, where we would seem to be arriving at that recognition from very different fields, from, I don't know, contemplative studies to neuroscience, to basically recognizing again that the human mind has been capable of so much more than we seem to acknowledge in our present, and that in your context would seem to be very much alive in these communities.
Yeah. And this answer is a little bit something that you have to touch on, kind of Josh's comments, is that it's not only that the register of the senses kind of functions around kind of in different spaces, but also that there are ways of feeling the world that doesn't necessarily flow through those categories. So in that sense, it does talk, right, to a lot of anthropology that has been done over the past years in West and West Central Africa, in the Caribbean itself, right, and how, or again, in kind of that humbling recognition, right, of the limited abilities that we have to sense whatever it is that we call reality. But the other thing that I think is important to recognize is that points out, right, as I said in the paper, points out to a different sense of understanding what makes the world, right? And in that way, it also talks to that history, right, of what is being discovered that is central to the scientific revolution of the 17th century, right? And again, I go on to talk about this more in other spaces in the book, because that is also something that changes. Okay, that is the claim, right, in a way of the new science. There is a way in which you are capturing, and not necessarily explanations about the world, but the phenomenon at least, we are capturing whatever it is that what makes, we are able to predict. But when you are saying you are not even sensing, right, everything that there is, that ability to predict becomes also becomes in question, right? So you're right, it does talk, and it kind of touches upon, I think, important aspects of anthropological, but also scientific science, yes.
One more question.
Thanks to both of you for such interesting papers. And I think I have a question for each of you that are both related to the sensorial as well. And so, Pablo, I'm wondering about how strong of a line you want to divide between these Black healing cultures and different modalities of healing within Europe. And I'm thinking, of course, of Pamela Smith's work and embodiment, and even the Galenic system, which is based, hot, cold, dry, all evoking, and so that the European traditions that we have most access to are the literary ones that, if we go with Smith's argument, are trying to distinguish themselves from these more embodied traditions. And my sort of sensorial question for you, Lucia, is, your source is a textualized version your sources. Your Amazonian source is a textual, and I don't even know where to begin with Ovid actually, because that we could ask the same question as well. But the one that I know more about, where the sort of you have as has been pointed out already, the sort of ethnographic gaze that is recording and transcribing these stories, and I'm thinking in some ways, the differences that you're trying to draw between them, which I found very convincing, might be even greater in their context. I'm thinking of, a lot of indigenous languages with the onomatopoeias and a kind of performative aspects of someone, maybe depending where the site of the telling would be, and so on. And just, I wonder if you've considered that aspect of the kind of context for these stories and what this might do to your kind of comparative metamorphosis reading as well.
Go ahead, please. Okay. So I'm just going to say yes, that this is obviously the case. Again in the chapter on focusing on this, but in the rest of the book, I talk extensively about how, again, these words are they are kind of created and summoning. They're not words that can be defined around those specific African origins or Native American origins. In Europe, and you're very correct in saying, these experiences and this world is also being reinvented constantly, right? It's not only people in the Royal Academy, it's not only people in l'Académie that are thinking in terms, for instance, of experience, or that are thinking in very different terms. That is why the term European, right, is also very problematic, right? When you are thinking about who are the actors that are coming into the Caribbean, even the term Spaniard, right? It's very different. Thinking about how they're thinking about themselves, somebody coming from Andalusia, somebody coming from the Basque Country in that moment, or the spaces like learned spaces, right? Vis-a-vis the popular realm of, for instance, Hitler, that is what you're talking about. So there are certainly, and this talks also to some of the comments that I just made, but those overlaps, right? And those are points of encounter, right? That you see. What I'm interested in here is that how, for instance, in the case of the Caribbean, it became very obvious that the people who became the experts in interpreting and kind of pulling all these strings together, where people of African descent, how they did it and why. And it has to do with the fact that the nature of those practices became very effective in talking to Europeans as well as talking to Amerindians, to criollos, right? The power of those practices that was based, I believe, in something that can be felt, became very obvious, right? And part of the reason is because of those overlaps, the ability for you to read what can be felt, and it has authority, right? But it has to depend on that too.
Okay, yes. In order to answer your question, I probably should give a bit of a history of how I look at these narratives, and the history has to do a lot with my book on the topic, in which I analyze Macunaíma and those narratives, and I chose those particular narratives published by Koch Grünberg because they were the source of a very important novel in Brazil, which is Macunaíma. In the book, I go on and on about precisely that topic. It was a book that came out of a PhD thesis done in a department of Comp Lit, in which every day I would have somebody from Comp Lit tell me, you should be in folklore, you should be in anthropology, you shouldn't be here. And every day I would say, I believe this is literature and I want to analyze this literature. It's not only literature, it's not the only way of analyzing, it's by far has many other ways and other functions, but it can also be analyzed with the instruments given by literary studies. Of course, there are all kinds of problems of, the way that the stories were collected by Koch Grünberg, the relationship between Koch Grünberg and the two speakers, the two storytellers. I go on about some of those details as well in the book. Also, he was recording those stories with a phonograph at the time. They were being told to him either in the Pemon languages, two languages actually, or dialects, and also in Portuguese, and when being told to him in the language was also being translated by one of them in Portuguese. There are all kinds of mediations and issues. They were also obviously performed, and there are descriptions of some of the performances, not in the narratives volume, which is volume 2, but in volume 3 and volume 1, which is the diary and the more ethnographic comments that Koch Grünberg makes, and he will talk about the way that they who were shamans, one was a shaman, the other was a shaman to be, were very, very proud of the way they told stories, and the way that the modulation would go, and the way that people would clap or they would laugh. So there are some descriptions. At the same time, I chose, because partly I was looking at it as a source of a literary text, to analyze it as the published version that is a testimony of those particular stories at that particular time in history as given to that particular. So there are lots and lots of mediations, and at the same time there are beautiful, rich, incredibly interesting stories. Right? So, yes.
I didn't mean it as a critique, just it
No,
seemed
no,
like
no,
that
no,
would
I
add
understand. And those things are very important. Those questions are very important, and they have to be taken into consideration. They shouldn't, at the same time, I think, paralyze us in terms of looking at the beauty, for one thing, but also the ethnographic or etiological aspects of those stories. But they are very important questions, yes.
Okay, if there's going to be any time for coffee at all,
Yeah,
happily
sorry.
things there. So.